Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at the most important thing that everyone needs to understand about photography, and it's got nothing to do with cameras, Photoshop or Lightroom. The most important thing that we need to understand about photography is what is the subject of the photograph. And a lot of people get this wrong, and a lot of so-called experts also get it wrong. And in this video we're going to take a look at understanding what the subject is and how that is the most important thing to think about when creating or looking at other people's photographs. So let's dive in and look at the photographs, and we'll explain it a little more in detail. So understanding the subject of the photograph is fundamental to our understanding of what the photographer is trying to tell us, or in the case of you being the photographer, in what you are trying to tell your audience. And many commentators get this wrong. They'll look at a photograph and talk about the main subject or the secondary subject. There is no main or secondary subject. The subject is what the photograph is about. What is the photograph trying to tell us? And so there's no main subject or anything else. There are elements that make up the subject matter that contributes to the story or the message in the photograph, but there is only one subject. So if we don't understand what the subject is of the photograph, we can't evaluate it in any meaningful way, and nor can we expect our viewers to evaluate our photographs if we don't have a clear idea of what we're trying to say in our photographs. And that's why I say it's the most important thing you need to know about photography. And it's nothing to do with cameras, f-stops, shutter speeds, ISO, or anything else like that. And the main thing is to understand that we need to focus on the output, the finished image, rather than the techniques and the equipment that goes to make up that photograph. Once we understand what the subject of a photograph is, we can then evaluate the merits of the image and decide for ourselves if the photograph is effective or not. And photographs come in a variety of forms. And understanding what the image is about leads us to consider things like the compositional elements, the subject matter that makes up the photograph, and there's a lot of nonsense rules about what should be used to make a photograph, these so-called rules of thirds, and you should always have odd numbers of elements in the photograph. They're all nonsense because they don't take account of what the photograph is about. Leading on from our understanding of the subject of a photograph, we can then determine whether there's a deeper meaning implied by the photograph, or whether the photograph can be considered as a fairly literal interpretation of a scene, event or situation, or whether there is something more that the photographer is intending to say. To put it simply, there are two types of photographs. Those that are concerned primarily with what is in front of the lens, what we call factual content or reportage or eyewitness type photography, and those that convey a deeper meaning or message. And those images are generally thought to be made behind the camera, in other words, in the mind of the photographer. So let's have a further look at these two different types of photographs. Those that are made in front of the lens and those made behind the lens. And firstly, looking at those photographs made in front of the lens, which we call documents or portraits. And these are images that invite further study and often attract our interest. And these can be eyewitness style photography, news reporting, or simply a photograph that represents an event, place or time. And these photographs take multiple forms. Portraits are showing us something about a person or an animal or a subject. And we can look at multiple types of photographs. These are all portraits. These all invite further study, but they don't necessarily have a deeper meaning. And this is probably the most common type of photograph that we take, because we often are interested in a place, a location, a time, or an event, and we want to record that for our own benefit and for the benefit of our audience. And these can be quite abstract images. There's no great hidden meaning in this photograph. It is merely an observation of an architectural design that piqued the photographer's interest and that was recorded for history. And most of the photographs I would take would fall into this category. But then we move on to the further type of photography, which we would call pictures or maps. And if you think of a map as being an illustration that has greater meaning above and beyond just the symbolism that's contained in the map, or these ones that Barthes calls punctum, which essentially means that they grab us somewhere emotionally and have a deeper meaning. And these are the ones that have that deeper meaning beyond their factual content. And these are the ones made behind the lens. Now, these are some famous photographs. This one of Stravinsky by Arnold Newman, a famous photograph. Very simple portrait of the person, but the lifted lid of the piano really represents the musical note, so that has a greater meaning beyond just the factual content. Or this one also by Newman of Krupp, the famous Nazi era manufacturer who benefited greatly from the Nazi era and used slave labour in his factories. And Newman photographed him and showed him as almost like being the devil incarnate. And that obviously has a greater meaning beyond the depth of just the content. And this one by Diane Arbus of the twins, a famous photograph, shows that even though they're identical twins, they're far from being identical in personality. And so these images have a greater meaning beyond this factual content. And of course, this famous one by Steve McCurry, probably the most famous portrait of all time, obviously displays the emotional effects of living in a war-torn country on this young woman. And so these images have a greater meaning beyond their factual content. And this one of mine that displays the idea or concept of people being two-faced or having hidden personality beyond their outer shell. And this is another illustration of a photograph that has a meaning beyond the literal content, as does this one, which also speaks to the idea of domestic violence and coercive control used in a lot of relationships. So moving on, looking at some further images, this one of a detail of a neck of a king penguin. It's not just a portrait of the neck of the bird, it's trying to talk about something a little bit deeper, and that is the way nature designs colours and uses patterns in evolutionary terms. That might be a little bit obscure, but for instance, this one, we're talking about not just a penguin feeding a chick, it's about the concept of nurturing and motherhood that's so important everywhere in nature, as is this one of the wandering albatross with the chick. And this one where we've got a penguin that's in the wrong colony. He's ended up in the wrong place, so it's really trying to illustrate the concept of being out of place or in the wrong era. And this one that I've used previously of the penguin chick demanding food, it's a matter of capturing the gesture and the movement of the bird to illustrate the idea of demanding food and so forth. So not just a simple portrait, but something with a slightly deeper meaning. As is this one of the sled dog. The title says it all. He's the captain and he's the one in charge, and he looks as though he's the one that's going to keep all the other animals under control. So there's a slightly deeper meaning in some of these. As with this illustration of the farmhouse in Iceland, where I'm trying to get across the concept of isolation and abandonment, and using the building as a very small element in the photograph, I've tried to emphasize the size of the landscape and how small and insignificant the buildings really are. As a similar concept in this one with the lone tree up in the Daintree area of Australia, and this one taken in Ljubljana in Slovenia, trying to get the concept of the mythology of the dragon, which is Ljubljana is the home of the dragon story with St. George. And even though the country is a very religious country, the story of the dragon dominates everything. And so I've used the dragon in this composition to show it dominates everything about the city. And this one, again, trying to show something a little bit more of the concept of wheelchair races, where the man and machine become merged into one, and it's difficult to then separate the two elements. And so using slow shutter speed and movement, I've tried to create the concept of a man and machine combined. Or are these ones where I've used some old Soviet era propaganda to try and tell the story of the failed system this is in Hungary, and using the text and the statue and the degraded image quality is meant to tell the story of the failure of the Soviet era in these countries. And the same with this one. And this one of the troll figure in Northern Iceland, it's trying to represent the story and how powerful these mythologies are. So the troll is a dominating figure in mythology, and I've used the background of this stormy sky to really illustrate the power and the relevance of these stories in the mythology of the country. And this one that speaks to the idea and the rise of fascism in the world today, using an old fascism symbol and the concept of the hooded figure, the anonymous faceless people behind the scenes pulling the strings. So there's a deeper meaning contained within all of these images, as this one that also speaks to the idea of conspiracy theories, which are very popular at the moment. And I've used the symbolism of the Knights Templar and the fact that behind closed doors there are things going on that we don't know about and we don't understand, which is the main part of most conspiracy theories, is that there is some group of people behind the scenes pulling all the strings, and that's meant to illustrate that concept. And even moving on to this one, which is a photograph illustrating the concept of the wood nymphs or the figures that exist in the forest, the mythological creatures, and all I've done here is used a little bit of recolouring to emphasise elements in the photograph that show these figures emerging from the forest, and trying to illustrate this idea of the mythology of the creatures in the forest. So you can see that there's lots of different concepts that we can get across in photographs made behind the lens, and it's up to the viewer to be able to interpret these. And here's another illustration of the famous old wrecked DC-3 in Iceland, and I looked at this aircraft and I thought it reminded me of the skeleton of a long extinct dinosaur, and so I photographed it in such a way to make it look as though it was the remains of some long dead creature. And using other elements in a composite image, trying to get across the sense of mystery and drama associated with horror movies and that sort of concept. And this one, where I've used factory buildings and elements in the landscape to try and get the message across regarding pollution of the environment. And this is a composite image made up of many elements that have been blended together to try and tell the story of the impact on the environment of industry without proper controls. And this one photographed near Newcastle in Australia, which is a major coal exporting port. And I've tried to use the elements in the sky and the ships waiting offshore to load coal to illustrate the impact of burning coal in the environment and the danger to our collective futures. And so many of these photographs can contain a deeper meaning. If you look at the photograph and study it in more detail, you can often interpret the deeper meaning. This is a simple photograph taken with intentional camera movement, trying to create a sense of drama and intrigue in the forest, and trying to get across some idea of danger that might lurk inside the forest. And this further one, taken in Tibet, of these two ladies performing a ritual of walking around the stupa to gain benefit in a future life. It's trying to illustrate the concept of devotion and sacrifice, and get that message across. Although for people that don't understand the Buddhist concept, it may be a little bit extreme. And just simple things like using a illustration here of these trees taken in the Snowy Mountains in Australia. I thought the tree on the left looked as though it was intimidating the two on the right, and they were reeling back in horror. And so I'm trying to use a metaphor here to illustrate aggravation and aggression and violence, and trying to get across the messages of different ideas. And this one that I may have used a few times before, of the mother and the polar bear cub that are stranded on land, because of the retreating ice. These poor animals were close to starving, and it was meant to illustrate the idea that the environmental damage that we're responsible for is causing the rapid destruction of habitats right across the world. And here's another shot of the bear with the cub. So looking at a series of these photographs, our job as the consumer or observer of photographs is to look at the image and try and understand what the photographer is telling us. And as photographers, our job is to try and get that message across clearly and concisely, and so that our observer or our viewer can understand what we're trying to tell them. In some of these images, the message is quite clear. In others, the message is a little bit less clear. So our job as photographers is to try and clarify our vision, and that is using some of the key compositional tools to help us get these messages across. And I mentioned earlier about these nonsense compositional rules. These are the key elements that we use in photography to create our images, and that is the use of line, direction, shape, size of elements in the photograph, use of tone, that is lighter to darker, texture, hue, and chroma. So let's just have a look at a few examples. Here we have a strong use of line and direction and obviously colour. A simple image, no deep meaning there other than just an observation of two beautiful birds. And this photograph here, line, direction, shape, colour, all of those elements go to build up the story here, which is really a simple observation of an old village in Iceland. And as I mentioned, we have these rules, these nonsense rules. Should always have odd number of elements. Well, as it happened, there were 3 lumps of ice on the beach that I photographed, and so it wasn't a deliberate choice here. It was merely finding the right compositional layout. And even with this simple composition here of 2 elements of a vine growing on a tree, I was trying to get the concept across of attachment or a couple locked together just using these elements. And obviously this one, which I used earlier, was just a purely geometric shape, line, direction, shape, size, hue, and chroma, all elements going together to make up this image, which is purely an observation of an interesting series of shapes. And the same with this one. Size, we don't have any sense of scale on this image of a piece of rotting kelp, but we can use the elements of shape, size, colour, and chroma to illustrate our image. And obviously in landscape images we often talk about the use of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and elements further away from the camera tend to be softer and lighter and lacking contrast, and of course we get that blue atmospheric haze that really gives us the sense of distance in the image. And with this one taken in the rainforest in Tasmania, trying to separate the elements out to demonstrate what we've seen here is a quirky image of some elements of a tree that look like an upside down ballerina. And so we've used line, and we've isolated these elements from the background by the use of selective color adjustments. And simple image of a rock pattern that looks like a snake. Again, it's a question of the color, line, shape, and size. So all of these elements go together to make our images and the stories behind them. This is an illustration of the reflected sky at a sunset on a beach, and just using the reflection in the rock pools and the water give a very surreal type of image. And again, in these further illustration of a group of rotting kelp, I've used colour, shape, line, and direction to create the image. As in this one, it's all about shape and repetition of shapes and colour. And in this image, I've used the figures in the foreground there to give a sense of scale. Otherwise, this photograph of the icebergs in Greenland would not give you any real sense of scale. So using those elements of the people there gives us a sense of scale to give us a sense of proportion. And obviously, colour is an important element. That's why we often photograph at the edge of the day, so that we get directional light, we get strong colours, and then the use of the geometric shapes and relationships there help to build up the image. And in this image, taken with a slow shutter speed, I've tried to get the concept over of early morning at the beach, and the image is deliberately soft so that you get the slightly mysterious, misty feeling about this, and we've used this to illustrate the sense of early morning at the beach. And this photograph, I've tried to see the concept of people trying to get their way to heaven by erecting these massive monuments, and it's just a simple observation, whereas this one, again, using the sense of scale, line, direction, shape and size, and a monochrome image, I've tried to get across the isolation of this little isolated graveyard in northern Iceland. And this illustration here from Valparaiso in Chile is really, this building is just clinging onto the edge of the cliff. It looks as though it's going to fall over at any minute, and so I've used the sense of the foreground and the shape and size of the building against the diminishing background to illustrate this. It almost gives you vertigo looking at the image. And so all of these images are using those key elements of composition, and so we can look at these other images that break the traditional compositional rules. And of course, one of the nonsense rules is that people should always be walking into your photograph, not walking out, which is just nonsense because that's not part of the story. This is a photograph taken in Cuzco in Peru, and it was really meant to illustrate the old Inca foundations that still exist, and the human figure is there purely for scale. Or this nonsense rule about having odd numbers of elements in the photograph. Well, when you're talking about two birds fighting each other, you only need two because that's the story, as is this one of the penguins, or the birds here, which are obviously a couple. So having odd numbers in the image is nonsense because it's not part of the story. These two polar bears were disputing a kill, and so there was elements of dispute and dominance occurring in this photograph, and that the odd numbers were not relevant. And the other nonsense rules, or never put your subject in the middle. Well, it's not the subject. The polar bear is the element in the photograph, and of course he's the primary element, so I'm putting him in the middle. As with this photograph of the sled dog, because I was attracted by the blue eyes, and so why wouldn't you put him in the middle? And other nonsense rules, never put the horizon in the middle. Well, sometimes it's relevant. You put the horizon in the middle, or your main element in the center of the photograph. This was really meant to illustrate the odd one out, so I've put him in the middle. Makes sense. And this illustration of the trees burnt in Tasmania, it was really part of the subject, which was the bushfires that have never occurred in this area, or very rarely occurred in this area as a result of changing climate, and so the element was obviously put in the center, and so on. And so we can look at a lot of these silly rules that don't make any sense when you understand the subject. But of course, sometimes these rules or recommendations can work because you can place things on the thirds in a photograph, or use odd numbers where it's relevant, or use the horizon at a certain point, not in the center. Or again, three elements in the image. It depends on what the story is you're trying to portray. And again, using panorama, elements are in the center and the horizon lines through the middle, and so forth. So there's lots of different ways you can use the rules, or the so-called rules of photography. When they work, but there's no reason to be bound to them. And again, with this one, I've broken the elements up into a thirds or proportions accordingly, and so forth. And so the final analysis is, when you come down to looking at photographs and your understanding of photographs, it's important to know what the subject of the photograph is, because without that you have no way of understanding what the photographer is trying to tell you and what the message is in the photograph, if there is one. So I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching.